In Episode 2, we discover that God has promised to rescue believers immediately before His wrath is poured out, and that there is a specific time marker in the book of Revelation which indicates that God's wrath begins after the Great Tribulation. This seems to solve the rapture question. But in this follow-up episode, we'll examine an alternative viewpoint espoused by the followers of the pre-tribulation rapture theory. The time marker we discussed occurs in that portion of Scripture in which Jesus opens a scroll with 7 seals. The time marker of Revelation 6:17, indicating that the wrath of God has begun, is found after Jesus opens the 6th seal on that scroll. We indicated in Episode 1 that this event happens after the Great Tribulation, and why the rapture immediately follows this time marker verse. Pre-tribulation rapture followers have long contended, however, that the wrath of God actually begins before the 1st seal, even though this requires ignoring the clear statement of Scripture that God's wrath begins after the 6th seal. Let's look at this well-known pre-tribulation rapture proof. These supporters point out that it's Jesus who opens the seals. After he does, supernatural horses bring famine, war, and death to the earth. Because it's Jesus who broke the seals, pre-tribulation rapture supporters contend that the plagues are being caused by him, and thus it's all his wrath. What these well-meaning Christians miss is that Jesus isn't causing the plagues simply by opening the seals. The riders on the horses are causing the plagues. Jesus is just permitting them, much as God permitted Satan to test Job. That was not God's wrath on Job, but Satan's wrath, with God's permission. And there is significant evidence that this latter viewpoint is correct. The 1st seal is universally understood to be the coming of Antichrist, a tempter and deceiver. These traits are inconsistent with God's holy nature. God does not cause deception, but he will allow it. So Antichrist's coming can't be part of God's doing or his wrath. Second, even more importantly, the Great Tribulation, which takes place during this period, is primarily the persecution of believers. As we've mentioned earlier, this absolutely can't be God's wrath. God's wrath is only against unbelievers. Now, this last point is so significant, it begs repeating yet again. As demonstrated in 2 Thessalonians 1:8, God's wrath is only poured out on those who don't know or love him. Just as it wasn't God's wrath that killed these faithful believers in the Middle East, the Great Tribulation won't be his wrath either, because during that period the persecution will be primarily against believers. God won't pour out his wrath on his own. He has promised us that. The Great Tribulation will be just what Jesus termed it. Tribulation, not wrath. Tribulation is something that Jesus has told us we will face in this life. This is a critical point that nearly all pre-tribulationists either miss or choose to ignore. These reasons alone should be sufficient to convince you that this pre-tribulation rapture proof isn't biblically accurate. But God was so concerned that we get this point right, that we know beyond a shadow of a doubt when his wrath begins, that he placed a legal proceeding, complete with witnesses, in the text of Revelation 6. So let's call the first witnesses. When Jesus opens the 5th seal, the souls of martyrs from all the ages will cry out for God's justice to come and for him to end the Great Tribulation. Notice the words of their testimony. They say that as of the 5th seal, God has not yet begun to judge and not yet begun to avenge. There is no way a righteous God would pour out his wrath before judging. Plus, at that point, God hadn't taken action to avenge either. This is amazingly clear evidence that the wrath of God will not have taken place before the fifth seal. And logically, if it didn't start by the fifth seal, it couldn't have started with the first seal or before the tribulation either. This is critically important. And what we have been calling the time marker verse of Revelation 6:17 is eyewitness testimony as well. It is the statement of all unbelievers as they look up into the sky after the sixth seal and see Jesus on his throne. Then they cry out to the rocks of the earth to hide them from Jesus' presence. And they make this critical testimony that the wrath of God has come or has begun. A legal matter is determined by two witnesses, and we now have two sets of witnesses. At the fifth seal, the first set, the martyrs, testify that the wrath had not yet begun. After the sixth seal, the second set of witnesses testify that the wrath of God finally has come or begun. Both of these eyewitness testimonies absolutely preclude the wrath of God beginning before the tribulation period or at the first seal. God presents a legally binding argument that the wrath of God, the justification for the rapture, happens after the sixth seal, which is after the Great Tribulation. As you've probably noticed in the past two videos, the time marker verse, Revelation 6:17, might be one of the most important verses in the rapture debate. For that reason, the verb translated has come in the verse has been questioned. This Greek verb is found in the Aorist tense, a tense not found in the English language. According to Dr. David Mathewson of Denver Seminary, Aorist tense can take on either past tense, present tense, or even future tense, depending on the context of the word. Aha! Some pre-tribulationists have said, perhaps has come in the time marker verse is actually in the past tense, had come, and it refers all the way back to the beginning of the tribulation. Perhaps it's saying God's wrath had come way back at that point. But remember, Mathewson said context determines the tense. And what was that context? As we have just discussed, right before the time marker verse, all the unrighteous see Jesus on his throne in the sky and beg the rocks to hide them from Jesus' face and from his wrath. This is a present tense reality to them. No one asked to be hidden from something that happened years earlier. That would be complete nonsense. The only possible timing for this verse is present tense, has come. And that is why every major English translation of the Bible translates this verse as has come. The King James, the New King James, the ESV, the NIV, and the NASB. There is no wiggle room on this point. In the last two episodes, we have shown that the timing of God's wrath after the sixth seal is consistent with the Prewrath Rapture. But because this theory is not well understood, let's take a few moments so that we can visualize what this theory looks like. The 7-year tribulation begins with a 3.5-year period Jesus calls the beginning of the birth pangs, marked by the emergence of false Christs, war, famine, and earthquakes. At the midpoint of the 7-year tribulation, the Antichrist is revealed. We will discuss this important point in greater depth in both episodes 5 and 8. After the revealing of Antichrist, the Great Tribulation begins. This will be a time of unprecedented persecution of believers and unprecedented testimony. The Great Tribulation does not last the entire final half of the tribulation period, but is cut short for the sake of the elect, as we are told in Matthew 24:22. The sign of the sun, moon, and stars cuts it short. It is at this moment Jesus appears in the sky and his angels rapture believers, as we are told in Matthew 24:31. This happens in the second half of the tribulation period, and believers spend the remaining time in heaven safe from the wrath of God, which will be poured out on the earth. And God pours out that wrath on unbelievers in the form of the 7 trumpets and 7 bowl judgments. Finally, after the wrath of God is poured out, Jesus and the saints return to the earth in an event our culture calls the Second Coming, to fight the Battle of Armageddon. The Prewrath Rapture theory is an improved version of the pre-tribulation and post-tribulation rapture theories, being consistent with all scriptures and eliminating the inconsistencies that plagued each of those older theories. I'm sure at this point you are convinced that God does permit Christians to suffer even great tribulation. But in the next episode, episode 4, we will answer the question that is probably on your mind right now. Why would God permit it rather than rescuing believers first?